In the mist-covered kingdom of Aramira, sound itself seemed afraid to exist. The fog was thick not only in the air but in the hearts of its people. Streets stretched in eerie quietness, as if the cobblestones had learned to hold their breath. No laughter rose from markets, no songs from the hills. The only voice that echoed across the valley belonged to the tyrant queen, Seraphine of the Veiled Crown. A ruler whose beauty was sharp as glass and whose heart burned with envy for anything that could inspire love instead of fear. Her rule was carved in silence, and her soldiers, known as the Grey Sentinels, ensured it. To speak against her was to vanish into the mist, forever unheard again. Among this kingdom of whispers lived a young woman named Leone. She was 21, with eyes that carried stories and a voice that danced like dawn breaking through fog. She was a storyteller, not just of myths or kings but of the people themselves. When she spoke, her words wove pictures so vivid that those who listened swore they could see sunlight even in the dull gray of Aramira's streets. Children followed her like petals chasing the wind. Merchants paused their trades. Even the weary soldiers behind their emotionless masks sometimes lingered in the shadows to hear her tales. Leone's gift was not just storytelling. Her voice carried something deeper, something ancient. It had the power to soothe grief, to awaken courage, to make the hopeless remember what joy felt like. It was said that once, when a plague swept through the lower quarters, she sat among the sick and sang softly through the night. By morning, the fever had broken, and the people called her the voice of dawn. But fame in Aramira was a dangerous flame, and light always drew the attention of those who ruled through darkness. Queen Seraphine watched from her glass tower, veiled in silver mist. Every word of praise for Leone pierced her pride like a thorn. How could a mere peasant girl command such love, when the queen herself ruled through fear? The courtiers, sensing her jealousy, whispered poison into her ear. "She speaks too much," they said. "Her tongue could turn the people against you." Their words fed the queen's growing hatred until it became a hunger she could no longer ignore. One night, when the moon was swallowed by fog and the streets were hushed, the Grey Sentinels came for Leone. They dragged her from her small home at the edge of the city, where stories still lingered on her walls, painted in soot and memory. Her neighbors watched from behind shuttered windows, trembling, but no one dared to speak. To utter even a cry was to invite death. Leone's mother reached for her, but the soldiers pushed her back into the shadows. The sound of chains followed, a cruel music that would haunt the village for years. At dawn, the square filled with frightened silence. The queen herself appeared, radiant and cold, her veil shimmering like frost. Leone stood before her, bound and barefoot, her long hair tangled from the struggle. Yet her eyes were still alive with defiance. The queen's voice rang through the courtyard like a blade. "You use your tongue to deceive the people," she declared. "You speak false hope in a kingdom built on truth and obedience. For that, you will speak no more." The crowd shuddered. Even the mist seemed to draw back as the royal executioner approached. But Leone did not cry nor plead. Instead, she lifted her gaze to the people, her expression calm and fierce. Her silence, even before it was forced upon her, felt deliberate, sacred. And then the blade fell, and the courtyard filled with the faintest gasp, not of pain but of defiance. The queen thought she had silenced a rebel. In truth, she had awakened a legend. They left her broken and bleeding but not dead. Perhaps the queen thought death too merciful. Leone's body was cast into the outskirts of Aramira, where the fog thickened into ghostly shapes. She awoke days later in the ruins of an old monastery, her throat raw, her voice gone forever. When she tried to speak, only air came out, trembling and wordless. She looked at the rising sun, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks, and pressed her hand to her chest. Her heart was still speaking, even if her mouth could not. From that moment, Leone made a vow, not to reclaim her voice, but to turn her silence into something greater. She began to write her stories in symbols carved upon stone, painted on walls, scratched into the earth. The mist carried her messages through the city, and people began to find them, short lines that read, "Truth has no tongue, but it still burns." In her silence, a new voice began to rise, not her own, but the voice of a kingdom awakening. And though the queen could not hear it yet, the first tremor of revolution had already begun to hum beneath the quiet streets of Aramira. The morning after Leone's mutilation, the kingdom of Aramira awoke to a silence deeper than death. The markets did not open. The wells stood still. Even the birds refused to sing. Word spread like smoke. The storyteller's voice was gone. The queen had done it. She had silenced the heart of Aramira. In her glass tower, Queen Seraphine declared a new decree: all songs, all stories, all music, forbidden. The penalty for a spoken tale or a hummed melody was imprisonment or worse. The people called it the day the songs died. Lutes were broken in the streets. Scrolls of poems were burned in the square. Mothers hushed their children when they tried to sing. Even laughter was seen as rebellion. The air itself grew heavy as though the mist had learned to choke the living. For a time, despair hung over Aramira like a shroud, and the queen smiled from her tower, believing she had crushed the soul of her people. But something small, something stubborn began to move beneath the ashes. Leone lived still. Her wounds had healed into scars, and her silence had become her companion. She wandered the ruins of her village at night, her footsteps muffled by the fog, carrying a bowl of ashes and a piece of charred wood from the storyteller's pyres. When no one was watching, she would kneel beside walls, doors and wells and draw. Not words exactly, but symbols. A flame for courage, a bird for freedom, an open eye for truth. Each mark whispered to those who understood. The first to notice was a young boy, one whose father had been executed for singing. He found her symbol near the city's gates and traced it with trembling fingers. That night, he drew the same mark on the side of his own home, and his neighbors copied it. Within a week, dozens of the same strange emblems appeared across Aramira, glowing faintly with moonlight when the fog rolled in. The people didn't need a voice to know what it meant. It was Leone. She was still speaking. Her eyes became her new language. When she passed through the streets, her silence carried more weight than any sermon. Her gaze met that of the broken, the fearful, the forgotten, and in it they found something they hadn't felt in years: defiance. She couldn't sing anymore, but when she stared into someone's eyes, it was as if she was still telling a story. You are not alone. Soon, others began to imitate her defiance. Farmers stopped bowing when the queen's guards passed. Women left pieces of cloth tied to trees, the color of ash, a symbol of mourning and memory. Men began meeting in abandoned wells, telling stories not with words but with gestures, drawings and rhythm tapped softly on stone. The silence that had once been a weapon now became their armor. The queen's decree had killed the sound of their songs, but it had not killed their meaning. One night, as the moon hung pale above the mist, the gray sentinels stormed Leone's village. They smashed walls, tore down the ashes from the stones, and burned every symbol they found. The scent of fire filled the air once again, cruel and familiar. The villagers were dragged into the streets, accused of spreading rebellion. But even as their homes burned, they stood together, their lips sealed, their eyes shining. The soldiers shouted at them to speak, to confess. No one made a sound. Leone stood among them, unflinching, her face lit by the flames of their destruction. A guard raised his torch and hissed, "What power has silence now?" She looked at him, steady and still, and then knelt, dipping her finger into the ash of a fallen home. On the ground, she drew one symbol, a circle surrounded by rays, the sun breaking through mist. The people gasped softly and the guard hesitated. For the first time he felt something unfamiliar: fear. When morning came, the village was gone, reduced to blackened earth and smoke. But on every surviving wall of Aramira, from the palace to the poorest alley, the same mark began to appear, drawn in ash, carved in wood, etched into hearts. No one saw who did it. The people said the wind carried it, or that the walls themselves remembered her touch. The queen tried to wash them away, but each time they returned, darker, sharper, endless. Leone's village had burned, but the fire she lit in silence could no longer be contained. What the queen believed was destruction had become creation, a movement that needed no sound to roar. Aramira was still quiet, yes, but beneath that quiet, something vast was awakening, the heartbeat of a revolution, thundering in every breath the people dared to take. In the ruins where smoke still curled from the remains of her village, Leone gathered the orphan children beneath a cracked stone arch. They huddled close, frightened, their faces streaked with ash and loss. She could not speak, but her eyes were fierce, alive with purpose. Slowly she pressed her hand to her chest, then lifted it toward them, a gesture that meant, "We are still here." The children mimicked her, small palms rising into the dim light. From that moment, a new kind of language began to take shape. Each night, Leone taught them patterns in the dirt, circles for hope, triangles for danger, waves for courage. She used rhythm too. 3 taps on the wall meant gather, 2 meant hide. The children learned quickly, their laughter soundless but full of meaning. Soon, the ruins pulsed with this silent code, a living heartbeat of defiance under the queen's watch. As days turned into weeks, travelers passed through the shattered villages and carried this new way of speaking with them. Farmers used it to warn of approaching guards. Merchants used it to share secret news. Mothers taught it to their children by firelight, tracing the symbols into the dust. What began as the language of a few became the whisper of a nation, a song made not of sound but of unity. Meanwhile, in her high tower, the queen watched her subjects grow quieter. To her, silence was victory. The marketplaces no longer rang with laughter, and the roads no longer echoed with songs. She believed fear had finally settled into their bones. But what she didn't see were the hands moving beneath cloaks and tables, the gestures shared between strangers. Every silent nod, every flick of fingers carried meaning. Her silence had not conquered them, it had connected them. Leone moved among the people like a shadow. Her hair, once bright as the dawn, was now streaked with soot. Yet wherever she went, walls came alive with her marks. The spiral of courage, the rising sun of freedom, the open palm of trust. People began to call her the hand of the wind, for she passed unseen yet left movement everywhere she went. Her silence had become a weapon, her gestures an anthem. One night, as soldiers patrolled the outskirts of a farming village, they saw children playing a strange game, waving their arms and drawing shapes in the air. Thinking it harmless, they ignored it. But within those gestures lay the message, "Tomorrow rise together." The rebellion had found its language, one no blade could sever. When the queen's spies finally brought word of this strange phenomenon, of people communicating without words, of farmers uniting with soldiers, widows and orphans sharing symbols of strength, she laughed in disbelief. "How can silence revolt?" she said. But even as she spoke, the walls of her palace bore faint carvings, the spiral of courage drawn by an unseen hand. By dawn, across Aramira, thousands stood in quiet solidarity, their hands raised to the sky. No one shouted. No one sang. Yet their silence thundered through the valleys, louder than any army's march. And at the center of it all stood Leone, her gaze unbroken, her hands aflame with meaning. In her silence, the kingdom had found its voice. The dawn broke over Aramira in eerie stillness. From every road, valley and broken village, people began to gather. Men with soot-streaked faces, women carrying torches and children clutching carved wooden signs bearing Leone symbols. No drums beat, no voices rose. Only the sound of footsteps filled the morning air, steady and unyielding. The queen's spies raced through the city, whispering that a storm was coming, not of noise or chaos, but of silence so vast it could swallow a throne. By midday, thousands filled the capital streets. They came dressed in gray and ash, their faces unreadable, their torches unlit until they reached the palace gates. Then as one the crowd struck flint to flame. A sea of fire bloomed across the square, flickering like 1,000 beating hearts. The people raised their torches high, but not a single voice broke the air. It was not defiance in words, it was defiance in stillness. From her balcony, the queen watched, her jeweled fingers gripping the rail. "Why do they not shout? Why do they not beg?" she hissed. The silence unnerved her more than any chant of rebellion ever could. Beneath her, the torches swayed in rhythm, left, right, left, a silent dance of unity. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The soldiers lined the palace walls, spears gleaming, waiting for the command. Their captain's hands trembled as he looked upon the faces in the crowd. He saw his mother there, her eyes fixed on his. He saw his younger brother holding a torch, his lips pressed shut in solemn strength. The queen's voice sliced through the air, "Strike them down. Show them what silence earns." But her words fell flat against the weight of that quiet. No one moved. The soldiers glanced at one another, their armor clinking softly. Some lowered their spears. Others dropped them entirely. The queen screamed again, but the noise only made her smaller, more desperate. Below, the people's silence grew heavier, a living force pressing against the palace walls. The flames reflected in their eyes, and for the first time, those eyes looked like mirrors of truth. Leone stood among them, hood drawn low, her torch raised high. She caught the captain's gaze and slowly pressed her palm to her heart, then extended it toward him, the same sign she'd once taught the children in the ruins. He understood. With a slow, deliberate motion, he turned his spear and drove it into the ground, bowing his head. The other soldiers followed, one by one. A ripple passed through the crowd. Thousands knelt, torches burning in unison. The queen's banners fluttered and fell. No one shouted victory. No one cried freedom. Yet the city square belonged to the people again, taken not by blood, but by the unbearable power of silence. The queen's fury was like a storm unchained. Her voice thundered through the marble halls, her footsteps echoing against the walls as if the palace itself trembled under her wrath. "Find her," she screamed. "Find the mute witch who teaches defiance." Her crown sat crooked on her head, her eyes burning brighter than the torches that lined her throne room. Courtiers cowered, guards scattered, and the sound of clashing armor filled the corridors as orders spread through the city. They found Leone at dawn, standing beside the dried riverbed where her people once sang harvest songs. She did not run. She did not hide. When the soldiers surrounded her, she simply looked up at the rising sun, her lips still and calm, her hands folded in silent prayer. The soldiers, hardened men who had seen blood and war, found themselves unable to meet her gaze. But duty dragged their hands forward, and they bound her wrists with chains of silver, leading her through the city toward the palace gates. Word spread like fire through Aramira. The people emerged from their homes, bakers with flower-streaked hands, mothers clutching infants, old men leaning on canes. They followed behind the soldiers in silence, step by step, until the narrow streets swelled with thousands. By the time Leone reached the palace square, the crowd had grown into a sea of faces, every eye locked on her small, steady figure. The queen appeared on her balcony, draped in crimson silk, her crown glinting under the harsh light. "People of Aramira," she declared, her voice echoing against the stone. "This woman has poisoned your minds with lies and rebellion. Today her silence ends forever." Her words rang out, sharp, loud, desperate. But the crowd did not react. Not a murmur. Not a single cry. Instead, as one, every man, woman, and child lifted a hand. A single finger pressed gently against their lips. The gesture spread through the square like a wave, slow, unified, unstoppable. The silence was deafening. Even the birds on the rooftops stopped their song. The queen faltered, her voice cracking mid-sentence. "Do you not hear me?" she shouted, but the sound seemed to dissolve into the air. Leone lifted her gaze to the balcony. Her eyes, filled with calm fire, met the queen's. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Then the torches around the square flickered, their flames bending toward Leone like a bow. The air shimmered with unseen power, not of magic but of will. The silence grew thicker, almost tangible, pressing down upon the queen until her breath came shallow and her hands trembled against the railing. "Speak," she demanded, but her voice cracked again, smaller this time, uncertain. The wind howled through the palace gates, scattering banners and dousing torches. Her crown tilted, her words lost beneath the roar of nothingness. And for the first time in her reign, the queen of Aramira found herself unheard. Below her, Leone stood unflinching, the embodiment of every silenced voice. The silence was no longer absence, it was rebellion, unity, and power. Even the wind refused to obey her tyrant's call. The silence broke, not with words but with movement. One by one the soldiers lowered their swords. The metallic clang of falling steel echoed through the city square like a bell of awakening. The queen's own guards, men sworn to her for life, looked at one another with shame in their eyes and dropped their spears to the ground. The sound rolled like thunder, each weapon striking the cobblestone as if announcing the end of an era. Leone stood at the center of it all, her chains glinting in the morning light. Her eyes scanned the faces before her. The mothers, the workers, the children who had learned to speak with their hands. She took a single step forward. The crowd held its breath. Then, slowly, she raised her right hand, the same hand that had once told stories beneath the stars. A moment of stillness stretched across the square, heavy and sacred. Then, as if the earth itself responded to her gesture, someone in the crowd began to stomp. One foot, then another. A rhythm, deep, ancient, alive. It spread like wildfire. Thousands joined in, stamping the ground in unison, the dust rising like smoke around them. The sound became a heartbeat, steady, powerful, defiant. The queen screamed from her balcony, her voice trembling above the roar. "Stop them. Stop this madness." But her soldiers did not move. They stood rooted to the spot, transfixed by the wave of energy that pulsed through the crowd. The queen's words were drowned by the rhythm, each stomp a declaration, each vibration a rejection of her rule. Leone's chains began to shimmer as the rhythm grew. The people's unity fed the air with something greater than rebellion. It was freedom itself, unspoken yet undeniable. The metal links trembled and then, with a crack like thunder, they shattered. The pieces fell around her feet, glowing faintly before turning to dust. Leone looked down at her bare wrists and smiled, the first expression of peace she'd known in years. The queen stumbled backward, clutching her crown as if it could save her. "This cannot be," she cried, her voice lost beneath the stomping of thousands. The marble beneath her feet began to quake, dust sifting from the palace ceiling. For all her power, she felt small, a single fragile sound against the roar of unity. Her guards stepped away from her, their loyalty broken, their faces reflecting only relief. The queen fled, her crimson robes trailing like a streak of blood across the palace floor. No one followed. No one stopped her. The people didn't need vengeance. They had already taken back what mattered most: their voice, their will, their freedom. In the center of the square, Leone stood beneath the rising sun, her hair glowing like threads of fire. The crowd's rhythm slowed, then ceased, replaced by an ocean of silence, not fearful this time but full. Complete. The air was alive with the weight of victory. Leone pressed a hand over her heart and closed her eyes. Though her lips did not move, the message was clear. Freedom had no sound, no tongue, no chain strong enough to hold it. The people of Aramira had spoken without speaking, and their silence had become the loudest roar in the history of the kingdom. You said. The ashes of the old palace still glimmered in the dawn light as the people of Aramira began to rebuild. Where banners of tyranny once fluttered, children now played among piles of stone, their laughter echoing through the streets like music reborn. No longer did whispers carry fear, they carried stories, dreams, and hope. Every wall painted, every hand raised in dance, every beat of a drum became an act of remembrance for what had been lost and what had been won. In the heart of the new city rose a great hall, shaped like an open hand. Its walls were made of polished glass, so sunlight could pour through and cast patterns that danced across the floor. They called it the House of Echoes, a place where no word was forbidden and no silence ignored. Inside, people gathered not to worship a ruler, but to honor the power of expression itself. Storytellers moved with grace, their gestures painting tales across the air. Musicians played melodies inspired by the rhythms of the silent march. Painters captured the fire in Leone's eyes on vast murals, her image eternal and luminous. Every dawn, the people would gather in the square before the House of Echoes to share new forms of voice: a drumbeat, a shadow dance, a poem traced in sand. And in these moments they remembered Leone, the woman who had taught them that silence could speak louder than shouts, that words could be carved from courage rather than sound. Though her tongue had been taken, her truth had endured, carried in the hearts of thousands. Elders told children how Leone had raised her hand and broken chains without a single cry, how her stillness had moved mountains, and how her silence had burned brighter than the queen's golden crown. Generations later, her story became the foundation of Aramira's rebirth. Every law, every custom now shaped by the promise that no voice, no art, no thought would ever again be chained. On the day the rebuilding was complete, the people held a grand festival. Lanterns shaped like hands floated into the sky, glowing softly as they drifted higher. Musicians filled the night with soundless symphonies, using light, gesture, and rhythm to speak to the stars. In the center of the square stood a statue, not of a warrior or monarch but of Leone herself. She was depicted standing tall, eyes open, one hand lifted in eternal silence. At her feet, etched deep into the marble, were the words that would guide all who came after. She spoke without sound. The wind moved gently through the city that night, passing through the open doors of the House of Echoes and into the mountains beyond. Some said it carried her spirit, her unspoken laughter mingling with the music of a free people. Aramira had been a kingdom of whispers once, built on fear and obedience. But now it lived as a symphony, not of sound but of truth. And in every movement, every brushstroke, every heartbeat, the people of Aramira remembered the lesson their silent storyteller had left behind. That silence, when born from courage, can echo forever. On nights when the moon hung low over Aramira and the wind drifted softly through the valley, travelers would pause along the old roads and listen. The air would tremble with a faint hum, gentle at first like a mother's lullaby, but deepening into something vast and alive. It moved through the trees, rippled the rivers, and brushed against every stone that once bore chains. Those who heard it swore it was not mere wind but a song, the echo of Leone's spirit, still singing the freedom she had forged from silence. The farmers said the hum carried strength to their crops, that when they worked in the fields and the breeze whispered past, their hearts grew lighter and their hands steadier. The children of Aramira would lift their faces toward the sound, whispering her name as though calling to a friend. To them, Leone was not just a story, she was a living presence, a guardian of courage who never truly left. When a child hesitated to speak, their parents would kneel beside them and say, "Listen to the wind, it speaks for those who dare to stand." In the great House of Echoes, her memory was kept alive in every performance. Dancers moved as if tracing the path of the wind itself, their gestures flowing and fierce. Painters captured the invisible rhythm of her song on vast canvases of light and shadow. Even the musicians played in reverent silence, using only movement and breath to mimic the hum that had become Aramira's eternal heartbeat. Elders told the tale again and again, how Leone, the storyteller who once healed hearts with her voice, had been silenced by the tyrant queen, how her tongue was taken but her will endured, how her silence spread through the land until it became the roar of revolution that shattered a throne. They spoke of how she taught a broken people to find power in stillness, to see unity in wordless defiance, to wield silence not as weakness but as a weapon of peace. Generations later, Aramira had changed beyond recognition. The streets once filled with soldiers' boots now rang with footsteps of dancers. The palace had become a sanctuary of art, its windows etched with stories and symbols, the same signs Leone had once drawn in the dust for children to learn her secret language. In every corner of the city, her mark could be seen, in carved hands, in painted eyes, in the single raised finger that had once silenced a queen. But though the people prospered, no one ever forgot the price of their freedom. Once a year, on the night of whispers, the whole kingdom would fall silent. No drums, no songs, no speeches. Only torches glowing in the dark and hands lifted high in tribute. As the wind swept through the streets, carrying that ancient hum, the people would close their eyes and remember what silence could mean. They believed that Leone's spirit lingered wherever truth needed a voice. Travelers claimed that far beyond Aramira's borders, across deserts, through forests, over seas, the same wind could be heard. In villages where tyrants ruled, it arrived as a faint whisper, stirring hearts that had forgotten courage. In cities choked by lies, it came as a low vibration in the night, shaking windows and waking dreamers. The oppressed called it the breath of freedom. The rulers called it the curse of the silent queen. But in Aramira, it was simply Leone's song. Children grew up learning it not through words but through feeling. They pressed their palms to their chests and let the rhythm of their heartbeat match the pulse of the wind. It became a sacred tradition, a reminder that power does not always shout, and that truth can rise even when the world demands its silence. One night, many centuries after her death, a wandering scholar climbed the mountain where the final battle had taken place. He had heard stories of the voice in the wind but wanted proof. As he reached the summit, the breeze grew still. For a moment, the world was utterly quiet. Then, faintly from nowhere and everywhere at once, he heard it, a melody rising from the silence, the sound of a woman's soul made of strength and sorrow and light. It was not a song of words but of will. The scholar wept. He wrote in his journal, "The wind carries her still, the one who spoke without sound, the one whose silence taught us to listen." Back in the city, the House of Echoes glowed that same night. A gust passed through its open windows, and every torch within flared brighter. The people looked up to the stars, where a faint shimmer crossed the heavens like a whisper made visible. And as they watched, the wind moved again, rising, gathering, carrying the hum across valleys and oceans. It was soft but unstoppable, weaving through every land where someone had been silenced, where truth had been buried, where courage slept. It was the voice of Leone, not broken, not gone, but reborn in every heartbeat that refused to yield. And so the legend of Aramira ended not with thunder or war, but with a whisper that grew until it shook the world. The whisper of a woman who lost her voice, and in doing so taught humanity how to speak. Cross-sword sparkles. The first light of dawn crept across the mist-veiled city of Aramira, painting the broken streets in pale gold. Smoke still curled from the fires of rebellion, winding through the narrow alleys like ghosts of the old kingdom. The air hung heavy with tension, the kind that precedes a storm or the end of an era. At the edge of the palace square, thousands of men and women stood shoulder to shoulder, torches burning in their hands but no sound leaving their lips. Their eyes were fixed on the grand marble balcony where the tyrant queen had once addressed them with her voice of iron. That voice, the one that had ordered tongues cut, songs silenced and stories erased, now trembled behind gilded walls. In the center of the square, surrounded by soldiers in tarnished armor, stood Leone. Her once bright clothes were torn and ash-stained, her lips marked by the scar of her stolen voice. Yet her presence filled the space like thunder. There was something unshakable in the way she stood, barefoot on cracked stone, hands bound, head held high. She was not just a prisoner. She was the still point of a storm that had been gathering for years. The queen's banner fluttered weakly above the palace, the sigil of the serpent's tongue, gold on black. Once that symbol had commanded fear. Now it looked brittle, lifeless, as though even the fabric knew its master's reign was ending. The soldiers formed a line before Leone, their blades reflecting the morning sun. But none moved. Behind them, the crowd stood motionless, silent, unified, waiting for a signal. The queen's voice rang out from the balcony, shrill and desperate. "This ends now," she cried, her words cracking under the weight of fear. "You will bow to your queen or burn with your rebellion." Her voice echoed across the square, but it was met with nothing. No jeers. No shouts. Not even whispers. Just silence. It was that silence, vast, immovable, suffocating, that began to eat away at her composure. Lena looked up at the balcony, her eyes steady. Slowly she raised her chained hands. The soldiers tensed, expecting an order to strike, but none came. Instead, she let her wrists fall apart, the chains clinking softly, a sound that rippled through the air like a heartbeat. Then, with deliberate grace, she lifted her right hand high into the air. It was the same gesture she had made on the day of her village's destruction, the same silent vow she had carried through years of persecution, a promise that no ruler could command the soul of a people forever. The crowd saw her hand rise. And then, in perfect unison, thousands of feet began to stomp the ground. Once, twice, 3 times. A sound like thunder rolled through the city. The rhythm grew faster, louder, boots, bare feet, sandals striking the earth in perfect harmony. The cobblestones trembled under the weight of their defiance. Dust rose in clouds, catching the sunlight, turning the air into shimmering gold. There was no chant, no song, no speech. But it was everything that had been silenced, the roar of a people who had learned to speak with their very souls. The soldiers faltered. Some dropped their weapons. Others looked to their commander, uncertain, fear flickering in their eyes. The sound surrounded them, relentless, alive. It wasn't just noise, it was power, the heartbeat of a nation that refused to kneel any longer. And then the first sword fell. A young soldier, barely older than a boy, knelt and placed his blade on the ground. Then another followed. Then another. The clatter of metal joined the rhythm of the stomping, ringing like 1,000 bells. The queen screamed from above, her voice high and cracking, "Cowards! All of you! Obey your queen!" But her words were drowned, not by shouts or screams, but by the sound of unity. Lena stepped forward, her feet leaving prints in the dust, her body glowing faintly in the morning light. She moved to the edge of the platform where the captain of the guard stood trembling. His sword shook in his hands, eyes darting between his ruler and the woman before him. Lena looked at him, no hatred, no fear, only calm. She reached out and gently touched the flat of his blade. The soldier's grip loosened. The sword clanged to the ground. He fell to his knees, bowing his head. That gesture broke the last chain of obedience. One by one, every soldier in the square laid down his weapon. The sea of metal shimmered like a river of silver at Lena's feet. The queen's voice turned to hysteria. "You fools! She is a traitor. A witch. She." But before she could finish, the people turned their gaze upon her. Thousands of faces, thousands of eyes, silent, unblinking, united. The sound of their stomping grew so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. Windows shattered. Dust rained from the columns. Birds scattered from the spires into the open sky. The queen stumbled backward. The strength in her voice vanished, swallowed by a silence that grew heavier with every heartbeat. Her words, the same ones that once ruled nations, meant nothing now. Inside the palace, servants and courtiers fled. The banners were torn from the walls, the torches extinguished. The throne room, once filled with song and praise, echoed with emptiness. At last, the queen turned and ran, her jeweled crown slipping from her head as she fled down the corridors. The gold clattered on the marble floor, rolling to a stop at Lena's feet. Lena stared at the fallen crown for a long moment. The metal gleamed in the dust, the last relic of a dying tyranny. She bent slowly and picked it up. Then, in one fluid motion, she placed it on the ground and stepped on it. The golden frame bent under her bare heel, its jewels scattering into the dirt. The crowd watched as she crushed it, link by link, until nothing remained but shards. A great sigh passed through the square, a collective exhale of generations held in fear. And then came a sound, faint at first but unmistakable. Applause. Not loud. Not wild. Just the sound of hands meeting softly, reverently. One person began, then another, until it spread like fire. The applause became rhythm, the rhythm became song, not one sung by mouths but by hearts and hands and earth. Lena stood in the middle of it all, her face turned toward the sky. She could not speak, but her silence spoke louder than any voice. Her chains, once heavy and cold, now hung loosely from her wrists. With a deep breath, she lifted her hands once more. The crowd fell still. She looked out over them, farmers, artisans, mothers, children, every soul who had once feared to speak now standing tall. Her eyes glistened with tears not of sorrow but of awe. She pressed her palm to her heart. And the people understood. They raised their hands and did the same. A wave of motion swept through the crowd from the front lines to the city gates, every heart beating in time with hers. At that moment the mist lifted from Aramira. The sun broke through the clouds, spilling light over the square, over the broken palace, over the city that had been both prison and home. The light struck the discarded weapons and the bent crown, making them gleam like relics of another age. It was the dawn of freedom. As the people embraced and wept, Leone walked slowly toward the center of the square. Her steps were measured, quiet, each one a statement. She reached the great fountain, dry for years under the queen's hoarding, and placed her hand upon its stone edge. Something in the air changed. A low rumble. A vibration through the earth. And then, water burst forth, pure and clear, cascading into the basin. The crowd gasped. Children laughed and reached out their hands to catch the spray. The square that had been soaked in blood now shimmered with life. Leone smiled, her lips forming words she could not speak. But those nearest to her swore they heard it, not with their ears but in their chests. Free. The word rippled outward, not as sound but as feeling. It passed from person to person, a wave of warmth, of release, until the entire city seemed to pulse with it. In the palace above, the wind blew through the open windows, scattering the last of the queen's decrees into the sky. The laws that had bound voices and broken spirits fluttered like dying leaves, disappearing into the horizon. By the time the sun reached its peak, the queen was gone, fled into the mountains, her throne empty, her power shattered by the very silence she had once wielded as a weapon. And Leone, the girl who had once been condemned for her words, became the voice of a nation, though she never spoke again. Her story would be carved in stone, sung in gesture, and remembered not as a tale of vengeance, but of transformation, the moment when silence stopped being submission and became the language of freedom itself. That day the people of Aramira learned a truth that would echo through centuries. You can silence a voice but you cannot silence its meaning. The chains that once bound them had not been broken by swords or fire, but by unity, by courage, by a single woman who raised her hand and turned silence into strength. And as night fell over the city, the stars reflected in the new waters of the fountain, each one burning softly, like a spark of her spirit scattered across the sky. The people stood together, hands clasped, feet steady upon the earth that no longer trembled with fear but with hope. And though Leone never spoke another word, her silence sang, deep, eternal and alive, the anthem of a people reborn.